Here we are with Peter Kornbluh, and we're talking about scandals of the Reagan-Bush era. If we could start, Peter Kornbluh, with an overview of how you see the scandal and give it an outline for us.
Well, this was a broad, multifaceted, multi-programmed, multi-layered, international set of operations that went on. And I think analytically, you can break the Iran-Contra scandal down into kind of three levels: bad policy, illegal policy, and constitutional crisis, and look at it that way. And we can go through each of those briefly and I think arrive at an understanding of what Iran-Contra in its broader terms was really about as a scandal and as a crisis for this country. Bad policy. The Contra operations, the Contra policy, was a widely unpopular policy in the United States. It was roundly condemned internationally by the allies of the United States of America. And yet the Reagan administration pursued it from the beginning, from one of the earliest days of the administration, January of 1981 onward. It became an obsession of this administration to have this policy, to win a victory, roll back a revolution in Central America, and declare again that the United States was tall and ran this hemisphere, if not the world. So on the Contra side, it was bad policy. On the Iran side, it was bad policy too. We can easily see it was bad policy because it was public policy not to negotiate with terrorists, and the Reagan administration had said that the Iranians were terrorists, were harboring terrorists and supporting terrorism, that Iran was a terrorist state. And it was our public policy, supported by the U.S. public, that we did not sell arms to this country or other countries that we deemed to be involved in terrorism. And yet it had to be bad policy because it was a policy that had to be kept secret from the American public and indeed from our allies around the world who we were pressuring not to sell arms to Iran. On the illegal side of this, looking at the scandal as a set of illegal operations, we can say clearly, even though the law has not been able to demonstrate this in the aftermath of the scandal, that the Contra resupply operation was explicitly illegal, that everybody in the Reagan administration knew it to be illegal, and that it involved a set of other operations, such as quid pro quos with countries in Central America like Honduras, such as raising money from outside the United States that Congress had not appropriated itself, that were straightforward illegal operations, and even Reagan administration officials themselves said could be impeachable offenses. On the Iran side of the scandal, we now have Caspar Weinberger's notes and George Bush's notes and other internal documentation which show that at certain points along the line when the president had decided he was going to be sending arms to Iran to mortgage the hostages, that he was told that this was illegal, that this violated the Arms Export Control Act, that there weren't the requisite covert findings under the law to do these operations, and that President Reagan said to Caspar Weinberger, listen, I can handle the issue of illegality, but what I can't handle is if it seemed like big, strong Ronald Reagan didn't take the opportunity to try and get the hostages out. To which Caspar Weinberger retorted, visiting hours are on Thursday. The implication being that Reagan would be sent off to jail and they could come visit him on Thursdays.
This is Reagan saying this, or this is Weinberger saying?
This is Weinberger saying this to Reagan after he said, Mr. President, this is illegal, you can't do this, and doing it through Israel won't wash. Reagan responding, listen, I can handle the illegality issue, but what I can't handle is the idea that big, strong Ronald Reagan didn't take the opportunity to get the hostages out, to which Weinberger responds, visiting hours, Mr. President, are on Thursday. We've put this little anecdote in our new documents reader on the scandal, and it's one of those important things, important stories, colorful stories, to give you a sense internally that it was known within the administration. The president was told these were illegal operations, and that is a big part of the scandal. I would say the least understood part of the Iran-Contra scandal, and yet at the heart of the gravity of this scandal and its importance for us as citizens and for this country as a democracy, was the constitutional threat that these types of operations represented to our system of governance. Buried deep in the Iran-Contra final report that Congress did is a chapter on the Constitution and the ways in which these policies, these operations violated the Constitution. And even deeper buried in this chapter is a remark that the approach that Reagan and his people took, that even if Congress cut off funding for certain operations, that they could then go and raise the money from outside this country, that they could use that money to field an army and wage a war that Congress had explicitly banned, that this notion, according to the Iran-Contra final report, was, quote, the path to dictatorship, unquote. Ironically, but perhaps not surprisingly, having raised the gravity of this crisis, the Congress then did nothing to prevent us from going down that path towards dictatorship in the future, which is also part of the Iran-Contra scandal that receives little notice, and that is what happened in the aftermath of the scandal. And I would say at this point that even as this country has gone through the trauma of this scandal over the last 6 years, little has changed in terms of the laws that govern covert operations, in terms of reporting to Congress, in terms of Congress's own position on its role and the demands that it makes about its role in the making of foreign policy in a democracy, that would prevent this type of operation from happening in the future. And if we look at Iran-Contra not as an aberration, which it wasn't, but as a part of a pattern of national security abuses that continued from the beginning of the Cold War all the way through till the end of the Bush administration, we see that we have to be very vigilant when it comes to the powers of the presidency, the powers of the national security bureaucracy in the United States. And even though the Cold War is over, these institutions haven't fundamentally changed. And until they do, we will probably be revisited by scandals of this type in the future.
Peter Kornbluh, the Iran-Contra Scandal, the Declassified History, to be released in March.
In March.
And we're talking about Iran-Contra. Now, and I want to come back at the end of this interview, and I want to talk about these laws that haven't changed and perhaps a prescription for changes and things that might need to change. I want to get your opinion on that. But let's go and focus on the illegal aspects of the scandal, which I guess we can look at at two levels. We can look at the actual scandal, what happened, how the law was broken by virtue of the actual illegal arms to the Contras and the whole North Network, and then let's take a look at the cover-up. But let's just start with the scandal, and I think it would be instructive if we came in this door. Let's come in the door of George Bush. Let's see if we can get you to give a thorough and complete analysis of what you think the role of George Bush was in the Iran-Contra scandal. And let's talk about the Central American side. Let's talk about the way in which Bush played a role in terms of giving Oliver North his office, to the phone call that came from Felix Rodriguez to George Bush's office after Hassenfuss was shot down. Let's talk a little bit about George Bush.
Well, George Bush, we have only recently found out in the release of a deposition that he gave to independent counsel Lawrence Walsh's investigators back in January of 1988, was much more heavily involved at the highest level of facilitating Oliver North's and the National Security Council's resupply operation to the Contras. Only this week, as we're being interviewed, has the story emerged from a document cited in the deposition that Bush was a key emissary in January of 1986 to go meet with the new president of Honduras, Jose Escona, and to tell him, representing now, this is the Vice President of the United States, the second highest person in the U.S. government, to tell him that the United States wanted Honduras to continue to militarily supply the Contra front in Honduras, and that this could be done with deniability, and we knew that this was a very delicate issue, but we wanted to continue our collaboration in the Contra resupply, that Honduras was a key country and a key actor in, simply because the Honduras's national territory was the staging ground for the Contra operations. It was there the Contras had their major bases. It was there that all of the National Security Council's weapons purchased in Europe, that Oliver North and Richard Secord purchased in Europe, were transported to the Contras. This is newest evidence, I'd say, as the smoking gun of Bush's knowledge of and active participation in the Contra side of the Iran-Contra scandal. For even though Bush has consistently said he was out of the loop on the Iran initiative, we have numerous documents showing him to be fully in the loop, and now we have his own diaries showing him to be scurrying around the White House trying to plug the leaks that were coming undone in the White House in November of 1986 as the Iran and then the Iran-Contra story broke. But on the Contra side, it's always been a little more nebulous. We know from Oliver North's trial that Bush participated in a quid pro quo arrangement with Honduras in 1985. We know that he went to Honduras and offered the quid, at least, to the Honduran president at the time. The pro quo came later through another emissary. Even though George Bush said it is the word of the President of the United States, there was no quid pro quo. In reality, we have Ronald Reagan signed authorization for a quid pro quo with Honduras in February of 1985. At the bottom of this signed authorization, it says CC the Vice President, which meant that the document went straight over to George Bush's office for him to see. What we don't have out of the Iran-Contra record, and this is extraordinary, particularly given George Bush's statement that he was going to make sure that, quote, everything, unquote, relevant to Iran-Contra in his files was released so the public could judge for themselves the veracity of his statement that he had done nothing illegal and had never misled the American public. What we don't have is a single memo from his own national security advisor when he was vice president, Donald Gregg, to George Bush when he was vice president. We are certain, as analysts of this scandal, that many such memoranda exist, but we don't have a single page of this kind of document, and that is an extraordinary historical omission, and I would argue part of the ongoing cover-up of who knew what when in the Iran-Contra scandal. George Bush's office was clearly involved in the Contra resupply operations. It was Donald Gregg who placed his close former CIA associate, Felix Rodriguez, in El Salvador. Rodriguez claims that he went to El Salvador just to do Salvador counterinsurgency operations, but the documentation shows that he met with Rob Owen in January of 85, talked to him about the Contra program, that when he went early in 85 to Central America, he talked to General Gorman about helping the Contras and that being part of his plan in being in Central America. And then in September of 85, he became the switching point at Ilopango Air Base for what North and Secord were starting up as a major airlift operation. And Rodriguez played a key part. We have documents that show that it was on the agenda for him to talk to the Vice President of the United States about the resupply of the Contras. Don Gregg later said in one of the most humorous efforts to deny a role in Iran-Contra that what the document really meant was resupply of the copters, not resupply of the Contras, and that the Secretary had misunderstood when she typed up this agenda. Those are the documents we have. We have those in our new book, and those are the documents around which we can build our case about the office of the Vice President and George Bush's role.
Now, you're talking, just to be clear, you're talking about a document that reflects a meeting between Donald Gregg, who's George Bush's national security advisor at the time when he's vice president, Felix Rodriguez, who was in the field at Ilopango Airport in El Salvador, and George Bush. And there's a document that comes out of that.
There are two agenda documents, scheduling documents they're called, where the secretary and the aides write down for Bush when the meeting is scheduled and what the purpose of the meeting is. And the purpose of the meeting was to talk about El Salvador and resupply of the Contras. And that we have two different versions, scheduling papers, for that meeting, both of which say this, and Bush and company steadfastly denied that they ever did talk about the Contras, and indeed that they had ever meant to talk about the Contras. Now, we've also had, for a number of years now, postcard that George Bush sent to Oliver North in November of 1985 for Thanksgiving, a Thanksgiving postcard where he said, "I'm, so proud of your activities in Central America and your effort on the Iran thing." This document, this postcard, has always been interpreted by those of us who have followed this as Bush's knowledge of Oliver North's resupply operation activities. When Bush was asked about sending this postcard and his reference to Central America, he claimed that he was thanking North for a trip that Bush himself took in 1983 to El Salvador, 2 years earlier, which North staffed. That was a totally implausible explanation, but indeed, Iran-Contra is filled with implausible explanations. Getting the hard documentation, though, is another matter, and we're still learning more about Bush's role in the Contra side of the Iran-Contra scandal.
Let's talk a little bit more about Donald Gregg. You raise a very interesting point, Peter Kornbluh, about there not being a single memo that is available between Donald Gregg, Bush's national security advisor, and the then Vice President George Bush. What indication do you have that Donald Gregg is involved in this operation while he's national security advisor to Bush? By the way, he was also the former National Security Council member under Carter, but that's another story. What do we know about what Donald Gregg was doing in that role?
Well, the evidence is sketchy. He shows up in Oliver North's notebooks in September of 1985 as participating in a conversation about using Ilopango Air Base as the center of this resupply operation. Gregg himself told the press and Congress that he didn't really learn about the resupply operation until August of 1986, when Felix Rodriguez flew up to Washington to talk to him about the problems of the resupply operation. Now, why Felix would come to Washington to talk to Don Gregg about the problems of the resupply operation if Don Gregg didn't even know about the resupply operation is one of those questions that these implausible explanations always leave you to think about. But so his argument on this, Gregg's position on this, his official position, never really held much water. And indeed, Gregg was one of the first U.S. officials to be caught lying point blank to the press as the Iran-Contra scandal broke, even before the diversion was discovered. When the safe house records in El Salvador were discovered after the Hassenfuss plane went down, when Felix Rodriguez was identified and he was linked to Gregg, Gregg point blank told the press that he never met with Felix Rodriguez, etc., etc. Howard Rosenberg of CBS cornered Gregg with evidence to the contrary, and he was forced to admit that he had lied about his contacts with Felix Rodriguez, and indeed later on actually had to produce a kind of a full-fledged chronology of all the meetings that he had had and phone conversations that he had had, and indeed the vice president had had with Felix Rodriguez. They were still able to provide, and remember, these are all CIA guys, George Bush being a former director of the CIA, Donald Gregg having risen to be a very high CIA official in Vietnam, and Felix having worked in the CIA station of Vietnam under Gregg, and that's where they became very close. And so plausible denial is part of the bloodstream of these men, and they tried to use plausible denial to argue that even though they'd had all these meetings, they'd never talked about resupply of the Contras, and we had no clear documentation to the contrary except for the scheduling papers. So there's been a real lack of hard information on the Contra side, and we're going to have to wait for Lawrence Walsh's report, which comes out later this spring, and for future historians in the Future Declassification Project to fully get our hands around the documentation of Bush's role and Gregg's role in this scandal.
There are several dramas of history that point us back to George Bush's office, and I want to sort of ask you to talk about them. One of these historical moments was when Hassenfuss was shot down over Nicaragua, and then some very interesting things happened within the network. Could you talk about that?
Well, one of the key issues that places a spotlight on George Bush and his office of the vice president at the time is it kept being in the middle of these operations. It was Bush's people were intricately involved in putting Felix in Central America, where he ended up working for the Contras. And then, when the most important event in the Contra War to break open this story publicly happened, the plane carrying Eugene Hassenfuss and two other mercenaries shot down over Nicaragua on October 5th, 1986. What office receives the first call about a missing plane over southern Nicaragua? George Bush's office. The call comes from Felix Rodriguez, who is in Miami and has been alerted that the plane is missing. He calls his friends at the vice president's office. He calls not Greg, but Greg's deputy, Sam Watson, at home to try and tell him that the plane is missing. And literally it is from Bush's office that the warning goes out that there's a real problem here. Eventually North himself is alerted by the CIA station chief in Costa Rica that the plane is missing. North is all the way in Europe at this time, devoting his energies to trading arms for hostages, and is forced to fly back to the United States when Eugene Hassenfuss shows up on CNN saying that he believed he was part of a CIA operation to continue to supply the Contras despite the ban on aid, and starts to name names. North flies back. This is a story that's not widely known. Meets with Casey. Casey says it's all over. Bring him home and shut him down. And the CIA, the planes at Ilopango are flown away from Ilopango. The CIA, at an unknown location, brings in a bunch of bulldozers, builds a big pit, puts these planes that the resupply operation has been using in this pit and sets them on fire. Lets them burn for days until the metal has turned to ashes, and then bulldozes the dirt over them. That was where the cover-up of Iran-Contra started, right in the aftermath of the October 5th downing of Hassenfuss's plane.
We're talking with Peter Kornbluh. He is the author of the newly released, to-be-released book, Iran-Contra Scandal, The Declassified History. Peter Kornbluh works at the National Security Archives in Washington, D.C. We are now talking in his office about George Bush's role. Another interesting thing that happened was when a man by the name of Jesus Garcia, who was a member of the North Network, claimed that he was set up on a weapons charge when he wouldn't follow what he was supposed to be doing in terms of the network. He was arrested in the house where he was arrested, according to his attorney John Mattis, Florida public defender, federal public defender at the time. There was a briefcase found there, and in that briefcase there were two phone numbers. One was the number of the White House, and there was a Watson, Colonel Watson, W.H. White House. As well as a reference to Colonel Doug Minarchik, I believe, was also in the Jesus Garcia suitcase. And what's interesting is that we now have George Bush's diary, where we have him talking about these reports that started to come out that Doug Minarchik in the vice president's office was involved in this. And he says, but Doug is a straight arrow. I know he could never have been involved in this. Dennis, the thing about the Jesus Garcia case and the case of Jack Terrell and the case of Tom Posey and the civilian military assistance is that that level of the Contra resupply operations, which was really the third tier, kind of on-the-ground mercenary level, deserves a lot of credit, a lot of attention for the fact that in some ways the story started to unravel there early on in late 1985, in the spring of 1986, when some of the mercenaries participating in this operation became disgruntled with the corruption, started to come to Washington, talk about the illicit resupply operations that they were involved in and the Contra corruption that they had witnessed. In the larger scheme of things, though, those are very, very interesting stories, but they had to be kept in perspective because I think from the larger picture is that they were not key to this operation. Certainly Oliver North's people, Rob Owen and others, worked with some of these mercenaries,
funded some of them, although not all of them, and in some cases fired them and got them the hell out of Central America, Honduras, and Costa Rica, where they were frankly creating havoc that the CIA felt it couldn't control when it needed to. But you really had the majority of activity and the majority of the money certainly flowing from the U.S. government to so-called private benefactors, PBs they're referred to in the cable traffic, as part of a cover of setting up this major resupply operation, almost identical to the airlift operations over Laos and Cambodia and in Indochina in the late 60s and mid 70s, using the same personnel really from those operations, and airdropping using skilled personnel. Weapons to the Contras, having CIA advisors and other retired advisors on the ground. There certainly were mercenaries involved. They received the early attention and were key to us understanding what was happening. But because of the early attention they got before the more classified information about the larger operations was known, came out in the way it did, they probably received more attention than was warranted, in my opinion.
Let me pursue that a little bit. I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's really important to focus on that because we heard a lot in the early part of the scandal, Oliver North, Rogue Elephant. We even had essentially the Christic Institute. Their suit supported that cover story of like a group of private rogue elephants operating outside the government. Could you, the secret team, and I'm wondering if you could talk about it as a structural operation of government. In other words, how broad was the operation? How inclusive in terms of government institutions, in terms of involvement?
When you talk about this, you really need to start with the issue of the diversion. What Malcolm Byrne and I argue in this new documents reader that we've edited is that the diversion itself was a diversion. And it was a diversion concocted by the Reagan administration specifically to take attention away from the other activities that were going on with illegally sending arms to Iran and illegally resupplying the Contras and quid pro quos and all the third country fundraising that went with it. To focus on a sexy point where the president could claim he knew nothing about it, and the issue of how many people were actually involved in that little central point, the actual diversion, the bridge between the two operations, Iran and Central America, could be cleaned of any high U.S. official, and the only person left standing on that bridge really would be Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who in many ways emerged as the official scapegoat of Iran-Contra. The reality is that worked in the beginning. All the press focused on, did the president know about the diversion? Then it became, did George Bush know about the diversion? When in really, the issues were far different than that. There were so many other illicit activities going on that we didn't know about that involved many, many people throughout the U.S. government. The quid pro quos, for example, a highly secret operation which the congressional researchers, the congressional committees, after a 10-month investigation, didn't even find out about. We had to find out about it through Oliver North's trial. We have Lawrence Walsh to thank for that critical piece of history. That was an operation that was authorized by the President of the United States after an interagency meeting involving dozens of mid-level U.S. officials. It was authorized and signed off on officially in documents by Secretary of State Schultz. It was forwarded to the Vice President for his knowledge, and involved ambassadors in a number of different countries and people all over the national security bureaucracy of the U.S. government. To give you an example of the breadth of that particular operation, and there were many, many others, including the transporting of arms to the Iranians. This is all to say that many people in the U.S. government were involved. North and Casey tried very hard to establish cover for the operation, first by moving the resupply supposedly out of the CIA and into the hands of the NSC. And a lot of the official focus of the investigation was, the NSC becomes operational, when in fact the CIA still stayed fairly heavily involved in the Contra resupply operation. We know that from some of the new documents which we include in this reader, internal classified CIA review, which the Center for National Security Studies just recently managed to get declassified, and for the first time it appears in this book, where you can read about the official CIA's involvement and Joe Fernandez, our station chief in Costa Rica's involvement in the Contra resupply operation for the first time at some length. The mercenary forces served two purposes, really. One, they provided a kind of a cover for the other illegal operations going on. As long as North could say, hey, look, there are these guys down there, they're part of the civilian military assistance, we don't run them, we're not paying them, they're aiding the Contras, some of them were in Vietnam. That kind of the presence of Americans, the presence of supplies coming in, the Contras continuing to receive training, etc., could have its own cover story. I would say to a lesser extent the mercenary forces, and I'm talking now about civilian military assistance, the Jack Terrells of the world, played a minor role in some of the Contra operations, Contra attacks. When you look at it carefully, you'll find out that most of those attacks were miserable failures, and that the mercenaries themselves were just totally laughable, inexperienced, gung-ho anti-communists who thought they were going on a joyride and ended up, according to Eagle magazine, going on a kind of a rat orgy through the jungles of Central America. It is hard to do mercenary work in Central America. Now, the key thing to understand is that at the managerial level of the Contra resupply operation, you had people who were not mercenaries. Richard Secord, his aides, Robert Dutton, Richard Gadd. These were skilled special operations personnel who were heavily involved now on a kind of private sector basis. They were semi-retired, let us say, being paid by U.S. government funds one way or another, taking directions from the White House, but officially operating out of U.S. government circles, in that they had retired and then gone into business for themselves, making probably 10 or 20 times more money than they had been making when they were on the U.S. government payroll. Many of these people, I must say, we know now from the Iran-Contra record, were simply in it for the money. The idea that this was patriotism, the idea that this was honor, and that, as Richard Secord, titles his new book, Honor and Betrayal, the idea that they were in this to serve their country, in many cases, was totally false. They were making money hand over foot, in particularly the resupply operation, and indeed in the overpricing of missiles, sending missile parts to Iran as well. But that's what I think you have to remember about the Iran-Contra operations, is they were multi-layered, but at the heart of it, it was a U.S. government operation from start to finish, authorized by the president, known to the vice president, and it involved, literally in its various components, dozens of U.S. government officials illegally operating behind the back of Congress, behind the back of the American public.
Clearly it did. I want to talk a little bit more about that, but let's just stay for a moment. I think your point is very good about they played a minor role, but they opened up a major hole. For instance, let's just follow Stephen Carr. He ends up in this March 1985 weapons shipment. He loads it in a house in Florida, and where there are drugs next to the weapons. He helps to forklift that weapons shipment at Fort Lauderdale International Airport in broad daylight, one of the most heavily surveilled airports in the country. He rides on that airplane to Ilopango. He watches as Americans supervise the offloading onto smaller planes at Ilopango, and then he rides on a commercial plane to Costa Rica and walks through customs with tons of weapons and is met by the former security director of Costa Rica. So How does this come together?
When you describe it like that, Dennis, it sounds like a huge shipment of arms, major cache of weapons going to the Contras that were really going to make a difference, when in fact it was a little plane load loaded by a couple of people. The biggest weapon it seemed was like a MAC-10 gun, when in comparison we had shiploads of weapons coming from China at that time, being offloaded in Guatemala, transported through Guatemala into Honduras. We had Boeing 707s loaded with weapons purchased in Portugal and in Poland for millions of dollars by Richard Secord's network. That was the real Contra resupply operation. Now, you paint the picture that you do because we found out from Stephen Carr first about those kinds of weapons, and that was the first knowledge we had about that kind of shipment. Now that we know the full history of this, I can tell you that was just a minor speck in a massive resupply operation going on. Nevertheless, its role in leading us to understand this broader history is fundamentally important, because Steve Carr was, as you know, arrested in April of '85 in Costa Rica, put into jail, and started singing like a bird about what he had seen. And it was his allegations that first led the press to start focusing on what was the shenanigans, the illegal operations that were really going on. But now that we know the full history, and I hope that our book of documents, which allows students of this history to read the internal documents for themselves, I hope that this will help us understand better. We can see that really wasn't a fundamental part of the resupply operation. It was at the third tier of the resupply, the grunge side, I call it, the grunge level, where guys were really going out there. Carr and others were working with anti-Castro Cubans. Now, they were involved, in things that are worth paying attention to. They were involved with John Hull in Costa Rica. CMA was raising money, but very little money, all said and done, for the FDN in Honduras. And some CMA people were actually acting as trainers for the Contras in Honduras. But when we look at Iran-Contra as a whole, we see that that was a level that was very colorful, important to read about, but it wasn't fundamental to the Reagan administration's major resupply effort that was going on those years.
Peter Kornbluh, what do you make of all these references in Oliver North notebooks to drugs? What do you make of the relationship to drug traffickers to operatives in the North Network? Is that important to look at?
Part of the problem with analyzing the Iran-Contra scandal from an office in Washington, or actually from any place in the United States, is that it becomes a kind of a white-collar assessment of a pristine world of decision-making around covert operations, when in fact covert operations, we know, and we know this frankly from the accounts of the mercenaries first and foremost, which is important, is an extremely dirty business. And it is clear that North and others were quite willing to work with the dirtiest and most sordid characters in the name of democracy, for God's sakes. Killers, terrorists, drug smugglers, in order to fulfill the obsession of overthrowing the Sandinistas. There can't be a more perverted distortion of the priorities of the United States of America as a country than what happened in this scandal, where on the Contra side of this, we worked with known drug smugglers. We moved the DEA away from, Oliver North's notes reflect, telling the DEA to take their hands off of the Santa Elena airstrip in Costa Rica, so that drug smugglers would continue to use it and the DEA wouldn't get involved with the Contra operations that were using that strip. We worked with pilots that we knew to be drug smugglers. By God, and we have this in our new book, Oliver North was preparing to pay Manuel Noriega $1 million to conduct sabotage operations inside Nicaragua 12 weeks after he had been exposed on the front page of the New York Times as a major drug smuggler participant in the Medellin cartel. That is the types of priorities displayed in this mission. On the Iran side, and we really can't forget about the Iran side of this scandal, by the end of the Iran operations, we were literally negotiating with Iranians who we knew to be involved in kidnapping new hostages. We were negotiating with the most radical elements of the Iranian government at that point. Some of them, Richard Secord has now testified, and Imran Nir, the Israeli counterintelligence, counterterrorism expert, said, we're clearly involved in hijacking and kidnapping new American hostages as for more leverage over the Americans. And yet we were willing to negotiate with them. In fact, we were undermining our own goals and setting the hostages free because we were bolstering people and giving them incentive to take more hostages. And that's the type of history that the Iran-Contra scandal carries. It's very important not to forget it.
Okay, and a lot of people really try to not only forget it, but to prevent the American people from finding out the full breadth of that scandal. And I'd like you to turn your attention now, Peter Kornbluh, to the nature of the cover-up. You've done some very good work on what the State Department was doing and how the Office of Public Diplomacy, I guess it was called, was involved in running a cover operation for this network, this illegal network.
I want to distinguish between two components for you. The Office of Public Diplomacy was involved in a massive propaganda and deception effort run out of the National Security Council by people like Oliver North and one of the CIA's foremost veterans of propaganda, Walter Raymond, in deceiving the American public and attempting to sway congressional opinion on the issue of aid to the Contras. This effort involved a very similar modus operandi as the Contra effort, where the CIA transferred the Contra program, if you will, to the NSC operationally. In the same way, the CIA transferred one of its own people to the NSC to handle a domestic propaganda operation because the CIA itself is legally prohibited from trying to influence Congress directly and the American public. This extraordinary propaganda effort involved using psychological operations specialists from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the office here in Washington to do exploitive brochures, things that would capture the eye of the American public and Congress. They turned the weapons of propaganda that were built to influence nations abroad, other governments, other populaces, on our own populace. And that's one of the gravities and the most serious, I think, and most scandalous parts of the Contra side of this scandal that's really not very well known. Documents on the PSYOPs people are included in our new reader, as well as the planning papers of the Office of Public Diplomacy, which were written by PSYOPs specialists working in the Office of Public Diplomacy. That, however, is a somewhat different issue than the broader cover-up of Iran-Contra that began literally on November 4th, the day after the Lebanese newspaper broke the story of Robert McFarlane traveling to Iran with Oliver North, trying to barter arms for hostages. And what you get out of Bush's diaries, what you get out of Caspar Weinberger's notes, is a series of meetings in the White House to decide how to spin this story, how to keep this story from implicating the president in illegal shipments of arms to the Contras. What you see throughout the entire month of November, up until the point when the diversion memo, the one memo in North's files that says that there is going to be a diversion of funds from the sale of arms to Iran to support the Contra supply operations, it's total panic, total decision-making focused on how to control this story so that the president isn't really impeached for the illegal sale of arms to Iran. Diversion was propitious. The diversion issue became very propitious. Then, of course, in the aftermath of these revelations, you had officials withholding their notes. You had CIA and other officials lying to Congress and investigators about their roles in both sides of the scandal. You had George Bush squirreling away diary entries that he had made that have only appeared now 2 weeks ago, 6 years after this investigation started. You had Caspar Weinberger deliberately lying to Congress about the fact that he kept notes that would have changed the course of this investigation, notes that, according to independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, might have led to impeachment proceedings against Ronald Reagan back in 1987. We are talking about a cover-up that changed the course of American political history, and that is incredibly important to know. We are still learning about the breadth of this cover-up even now, and we will probably learn a great deal more about it when the independent counsel releases his report later this spring. In our book, we have included a whole final section on the investigation into Iran-Contra and the cover-up itself. We've included many of the court documents generated by the independent counsel's office, which aren't readily accessible to the American public, and I think it's one of the most important contributions that this new documents reader makes.
Peter, can I get you to you have right there in front of me excerpts, or actually the release of the Bush Diary. I'm wondering if I could get you to read some juicy little excerpts from the Bush Diary so that people can get a sense of what was released and what perhaps George Bush was withholding about his own involvement in the scandal.
Let me read you one of Bush's first entries on November 5th, 1986, literally 2 days after Al-Shara, the Lebanese newspaper, first broke the story of the arms for hostages deals, and the U.S. press is just then starting to report on this, to ask questions to the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration is denying knowledge of any of this. And Bush writes, Bush actually dictates in his diary. He dictated his diary into a dictaphone, and then later the tapes were sent off to a confidant in Houston and transcribed and put in a safe. But at that point on November 5th, he says into his tape recorder, "On the news at this time is the question of the hostages. There is some discussion of Bud McFarlane having been held prisoner in Iran for 4 days. I'm one of the few people that know fully the details. There's a lot of flack and misinformation out there. It is not a subject we can talk about." And later on that day he writes, "The media is pressing for full disclosure, but this is one operation that has been very, very tightly held, and I hope it will not leak." Of course, it did leak, and as the paper started to report more, and as there was more pressure on the White House to divulge information about these allegations, Bush, according to his diary, finds himself in the role of the little boy trying to stick his finger in the dam to keep the dam from breaking and the water from spilling all over the place. And you literally see him running around the White House, being the key person trying to keep Secretary of State George Shultz from resigning in anger and from spilling the beans about what really happened with the Iran Arms for Hostages initiative. And one of the most important things about the Bush diaries is that we never had contemporary documents about discussions with Ronald Reagan before. Now we have Bush's accounts of a number of meetings with the President of the United States, which are very important and which we've included in our book. But just to give you a sense of this, Bush is being talked to by Reagan's aides, Poindexter and Don Regan, about George Shultz, about Shultz threatening to resign, threatening to jump ship, and Bush saying, "Well, I'll go talk to him, I'll take care of it." So Bush goes on November 20th to the White House and to talk to President Reagan about this, and he reports into his tape recorder on that day. "A tough day in the White House. All kinds of odds and ends. The President tells me that at lunch I really had a shocker. Don Regan has just told me that George Shultz has told him Poindexter has to go or he goes. It doesn't sound like George, that kind of ultimatum. We talked at length, and I suggested to the President that the only thing he could do was call a Monday meeting, which he decided to do, to get the key NSC players together, to get them all to lay it on the table, and to just simply say, we're going to hammer this thing out. And what are you upset about, George? And what are you upset about, Poindexter?" I mean, here you had George Bush virtually, the campfire girl's kind of supervisor, And what are you upset about, Molly? And can you tell us what you're angry about, Susan? That type of role. But while we can see the color and the humor in this, what we get historically out of it is a person who's very actively engaged in the cover-up operations, in trying to contain this story and trying to sort it out within the White House. And that's what the Dyers, I think, show. Far from exculpating George Bush as being out of the loop, not being a key player, they show him to be in the inner circle, to be informed, to be active in dealing with this. Certainly, they don't show him to be saying we should lie to the American people, but they do show him to be part of a team that is shaping the way this story is coming out. Then, of course, we know that he hid these notes for more than 6 years, and that has, I think, been part of an overall cover-up, which is only now starting to unravel.
Well, George Bush still maintains, even with the release of these documents, that he is out of the loop. Is he a liar?
George Bush has, I think, like the people around him in the Reagan White House, systematically lied to the American public. There is no other conclusion one can come to with the documentary evidence that we now have. The key question, Dennis, has always been, where was George? The documents tell us where George was, and he was in the loop clearly on the Iran initiative. And now we know even more fully from these documents that have just been released that he was in the loop clearly on the Contra resupply operation. I think history is going to judge Bush to be part and parcel of a systematic, dishonest effort to deceive the American public and the press year after year after year. An effort that, by the way, started literally in the beginning of 1981 when the Reagan administration decided it was going to try and overthrow the Sandinista government, and went to Congress and told Congress that it wanted to interdict arms allegedly flowing from Nicaragua to El Salvador, when in fact Reagan administration officials were already at that early stage negotiating with the Honduran military about overthrowing the Sandinista government. It started way back then, and that's what it was really all about. And I think that's the way history will judge George Bush, as a liar and a cheat on the American public.
This is Dennis Bernstein. I'm speaking with Peter Kornbluh. He is the co-author of the Iran-Contra Scandal, the Declassified History, and he is the co-author with Malcolm Byrne, and there's a foreword by Theodore Draper, who wrote some very interesting articles that I believe came out in the New York Review of Books some time ago.
And then took those articles and made them into what is still the definitive book on the Iran-Contra Scandal, called A Very Thin Line.
I'd like you to talk about some of the larger issues that are brought up by this scandal and by the behavior of the United States government through this scandal. Let me ask it to you this way, sort of a devil's advocate. What is wrong with George Bush going to the president of Honduras and asking for an arrangement that they will support U.S. Interests, if you will, in Honduras in exchange for more support for what perhaps George Bush was suggesting would be to help a budding democracy in Honduras? What's wrong with the kinds of behavior that we saw exhibited in Iran-Contra? Besides the law being broken.
Well, Iran-Contra was about illegal foreign policy. As I mentioned before, it was about bad foreign policy. And it was about undermining the Constitution of the United States. We live in a democracy. We cannot have a democracy unless people are informed about the activities of their government. That's why the National Security Archive, where I work, exists, is to obtain the internal documentation, make that available to the American public so that there can be a broader debate over what our country does, what our country stands for. What was wrong with what George Bush and Ronald Reagan, Oliver North, and others did would take, I'll tell you, another hour to tick off. To list off all of what was wrong with it. But the bottom line is I think twofold. One, it was against the law. The Congress representing the will of the American people had terminated aid to the Contras. They had said there will be no war. It was a constitutional prerogative of Congress to use its power of the purse, which the Constitution gives it, to affect foreign policy in this way and to reflect the will of the democracy that is our system of governance. The Reagan administration's efforts to circumvent this, to raise money outside of the constitutional procedures of congressional authorization, is a threat to the basic structures of our political system. Any president who wanted to do something that Congress refused to do could simply go ask the King of Saudi Arabia, or go ask, or go ask Ross Perot or Nelson Bunker Hunt, to contribute the funds necessary to carry out these types of operations, which is exactly what Ronald Reagan and his minions did. I think it's clear, just looking back on the uproar caused by the Iran-Contra Scandal, the paralytic effect that it had on the presidency, the possibility that we might have actually gone through impeachment procedures had there not been the type of cover-up that there was, that these types of operations are so fundamentally deleterious to our political system that they simply cannot be allowed to happen in the future. And the failure of Congress, and to a degree the American public, to have learned that lesson out of Iran-Contra, or to have learned it out of the intelligence abuses scandals of the 1970s, or out of the Vietnam War, or out of the Bay of Pigs scandal way back in the early 60s, our fundamental inability to learn this and do something about it, to act upon our learning, is what I think gives us pause when we look down the future. Hopefully with the Cold War over, with a new generation of policymakers in place, we may, in an evolutionary way, evolve away from this kind of abuse of national security power. But looking back over the last 30 or 40 years of history, being able to tell you from the position of senior analyst that I am here at the archive, that still 40 years later we can't get the CIA to release the operational documents of the CIA's overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala in the mid-1950s, that type of Cold War secrecy, Cold War mentality still lives. That gives us pause as we look towards the future.
Would you say that would be a crucial thing to change if we were to go at it in a structural way, the nature of secrecy and classification of documents?
It is a fundamental to permanently ending the Cold War, to permanently halting these types of operations that we saw in Iran-Contra from taking place again, to open up public access to classified information, to rewrite the laws on classification, to change the procedures by which government agencies, CIA, State Department, the Defense Department, etc., the NSC, release documents, to have a new generation of laws governing freedom of information. Only when the public has access to this information will there be full debate, and will the real check and balance of our political system come into effect, come into play, and that is the will of the American public, their desire to have certain policies conducted in their name and not other policies, and the ability of the executive branch to conduct its policies in secrecy will be seriously affected by further freedom of information, which is one of the things we're hoping for under the new administration.